So what do we do when we're met with extensively an emotional wall? Someone who cannot hear us, even if they're saying, I want to learn, I want to change, but their actions are not showing that.
First of all, I'm so sorry to who's ever going through that. It's so incredibly painful. It's so incredibly disorienting. And if that is abusive and the emotional, physical, psychological impacts of that are real, it's so disorienting to be with someone with psychological, emotional abuse and all of that. So the exactly what you said, Jessica, is actions way by far outweighs their words. Oh, I want this, but their actions are completely showing other ways. That is a sign for an immediate boundary. And if you're so deep in it where there's that cognitive dissonance piece where you're just like, but they're good, but they're bad, but this and that, and you're really confused. I think sometimes you could honestly, that's where you need a third party person that's neutral. I've seen this with clients of some form of an abusive parent where the therapy was maybe just 1 or 2 sessions, but it was confirmation of this is abusive and this isn't working. And oh, I can't do any work with them. This is as far as it goes. Right. And I have a caveat with that too, that there's some narcissists that are so tricky. And if it's not a narcissistic informed therapist, then that can go sideways and all of there's a number of things with that too. But if you're thinking it's psychological abuse and emotional abuse, check in with people. This is what's happening, just so that you can get that validation to go, I need to pull out. As much as I desperately want to have repair, this person is not capable, even if they're saying they are. Very painful, painful place to be.
How do you have that conversation when you know that the person probably isn't going to be receptive and maybe they did want to keep contact, but in a boundary way too?
You know, when you've gone through real psychological, emotional abuse, especially with a parent, it's such a deep process. There's so much shame of, oh my gosh, I had to completely walk away from a parent, and they have so much shame about that. And comes back to the precipice of they're not able to repair, but they're my parent. And what do I do? And there's sometimes in your healing journey where the healing is in how you're showing up for yourself. And there might be a period of time or indefinitely where you go, if it's that toxic, where you go, I can't have a relationship, period, with this person. I can love and have empathy for the trauma they've went to, but they're just too toxic for me to be in relationship, and I can't ever be in contact with them. And that's a real thing. There's other different kind of rates of spectrum of where somebody falls, where it's like, it's not abusive, but it's also not a relationship that can make repair. And in that case, they might need period of no contact, and they might then get to a point where they're like, okay, my work when my parents come to town is that they stay in a hotel and they don't stay with me. And I make sure that I'm really regulated and grounded before I go in, because the second my nervous system sees their face and hears their voice, I get really dysregulated. So their work is to stay really present with themselves, validate their reality, be with themselves, and really attune to what their boundaries are at that period of time in their own healing is. Again, a lot of nuance here goes back to honoring yourself and your process of what you need, because most likely the wounding is that you were not seen, you were not attuned to, you were dismissed. And so how do you be in relationship, right? Given what the spectrum of that person is and where you're at, to then interact with somebody that you are aware of.
A lot of this really goes back to our boundary workshop. If something isn't as extreme as that example, I can see a lot of people who feel like the aligned action is to leave or set a boundary or whatever. But the piece that's so important before one does that, again, if it's a safe environment that's not abusive, you just have to do the subconscious work on yourself first. You have to before you set that boundary, or you'll be in this position where you're not heard. And there's going to be the shadow phase, usually, no matter what boundary you set. Usually, if people who you're setting boundaries with aren't extremely evolved, and it's going to trigger their stuff, and you're going to have some sort of a shadow reaction from them. And in order to have a nervous system that's strong enough to be compassionate during that time and see where things land on the other side and see if they impede on that boundary again, you have to address the subconscious work. I mean, I just think that that's so huge. And then the other thing I kind of was curious to ask you about, Janelle, and I'm sure some people are sitting here listening to this who are in the situation of this example or versions of this with friendships, and they have had to exit the relationship. Like, let's give them some tools for the aftermath. course, it's hard to walk through that fire and do this, but the aftermath is where like the grief comes up and the guilt comes up and the shame and you now have that. And of course, you're very magnetic for walking through that fire, like jumping off that cliff. But, it would be nice to just touch on like some tools when you're on the other side and you're out of it, and the resentment and just all that stuff that's going to follow.
Well, and also the person like trying to get back in, trying to use their tactics to entice you back in. Maybe they're charming now and then you second guess yourself. I've seen that happen a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you name that too, because it's like there is so much grief. What's really interesting, just friendship breakups. Those are honestly sometimes more painful than partner breakups. I think maybe because we don't anticipate them or expectation, right? That they're going to be forever and all of this. And anyways, so they can be so painful. And I guess I want to name your grief as real. There is a real grieving cycle and all the different phases of grief that needs to happen, and it can be very painful. There's a book that I want to name for somebody that's really deeply in it. It's called Necessary Endings, and it talks about manifestation stuff of, in order for the good to come, the negative has to go. It talks about pruning, and it talks about kind of normalizing necessary endings, because there can be a lot of shame around it too.
Gosh, this would be such a good workshop one day, where the breakup or breakthrough or something. It would just be so good for people because it's such a gray space. When I think about this topic in general, the more integrated we become from this work, from just honestly like years of the work, the more that you integrate, the more that these things aren't going to rock your world anymore. And the more that you're not going to address stuff from a reactive place anymore, or care about things from a reactive place anymore. When I'm saying integrated, again, just getting back to that like whole worthy self where your inner child's not being triggered as much anymore, and you can start to see people much more compassionately. There's nowhere in my life that anybody is sitting that is like impeding on my life, like gaslighting me. There's nowhere. So it's not this permission to just let these porous energies in at all. But I guess the more that you can just trust the process of integration through this work with third-party help and the years that will go into it, it's like this stuff just doesn't get you as much anymore. It just doesn't ruffle your feathers as much anymore. If you're really in it and you're experiencing this right now with someone in your life, that's the one thing I want to say that you have control over, is just addressing your inner child over and over, all the feelings that are coming up around it, all of the emotions and stages that are coming up around it. The more that you can use that and work through that, it's going to super speed your integration process. And eventually you're going to get to this place where you're just a lot more in control and neutral.